The senior archivist of the Virellian Concord had finished their study of human history 3 standard cycles before the first shots were fired, and they were confident in their conclusions because the record seemed clear to them in a way only outsiders can be confident about another species' mistakes, showing a young civilization that fought itself constantly, exhausted its own planet, nearly destroyed its biosphere more than once, and only reached the stars through desperation rather than discipline. And this summary was presented calmly to the Concord Council chamber, where delegates from 37 species listened as the lead analyst explained that humans were emotionally driven, prone to internal division, and incapable of sustaining unified action under prolonged pressure, which in Virellian strategic doctrine meant they would fracture quickly when confronted by a superior external force. And the analysts cited dozens of examples from human wars where alliances broke, governments fell, and populations turned on their leaders. And while the humans did sometimes display bursts of alarming creativity, those moments were followed by collapse, exhaustion, and regret, and so the Council accepted the report as complete, filing humanity under the category of limited threat, suitable for coercion but not annihilation, a species to be disciplined rather than destroyed, and with that understanding the Concord authorized Operation Silent Margin, a limited border. Enforcement action designed to seize several human frontier systems and force Earth into accepting subordinate trade status, a move that had worked flawlessly on 8 other emerging species. And the Virellians were careful to note that they were not acting out of cruelty but necessity, because the humans were expanding rapidly and unpredictably, and unchecked growth was always destabilizing. And so the first Concord fleets crossed into human-controlled space with precise timing and overwhelming numerical superiority, expecting a brief demonstration of force followed by negotiation. While on Earth, the first alerts reached Admiral Jonathan Hale during a routine orbital review, and Hale, a man in his early 60s with careers spanning asteroid piracy suppression and border skirmishes with minor powers, listened without interruption as his staff summarized the situation, then quietly asked him to replay the Concord Declaration, and as the alien voice repeated its formal notice of corrective action, Hale noted the wording, the assumptions, and the unmistakable tone of condescension, and he said nothing for a long moment before ordering all regional commanders to switch to contingency Pasha Black, a level that had never been publicly acknowledged. And when a junior officer hesitated, pointing out that the Concord had not declared total war, Hale replied that they never did, because species that declared total war did not expect to survive the response. And within hours, encrypted signals spread across human space, waking reserve fleets, activating shipyards thought dormant, and pulling civilian infrastructure into military logistics, while at the same time Ambassador Karen Holt stood before the Concord Council, calm and controlled, listening as a Virellian speaker explained that humanity should see this action as an opportunity to learn restraint. And Holt responded politely, thanking them for their concern, agreeing that human history was full of mistakes, and stating that humans had indeed learned from it, a statement that drew mild amusement from the chamber, because the Virellians believed learning meant avoiding conflict, whereas human learning had always meant something else entirely. And as Concord fleet secured the first 3 frontier systems with minimal resistance, their commanders reported exactly what the analysts had predicted. Human forces withdrew rather than engaged. Communications traffic spiked with what appeared to be internal argument, and several human colonies broadcast evacuation notices that looked like panic, and the Virellian high strategist declared the operation a success in its opening phase, unaware that Admiral Hale was watching the same data and nodding in satisfaction, because withdrawal was not retreat in human doctrine, but space creation, and argument was not collapse, but debate preceding consensus, and evacuation was not fear, but preparation. And as the Concord fleets advanced deeper, stretching their supply lines with every confident jump, human ships vanished from predictable patrol routes, reappearing in patterns that made no sense to alien analysts trained to expect linear response. And on Earth, President Laura Bennett convened a closed session of Security Assembly, where scientists, generals, and industrial leaders spoke in blunt terms about timelines, losses, and acceptable damage. And there were no speeches about honor or destiny, only a shared understanding that the Concord had made a familiar error, the same one every invader in human history had made, which was believing that knowing human failures meant understanding human limits. And as the first Concord commander authorized the seizure of 4th system, dismissing reports of missing reconnaissance drones as sensor errors, the final preparations were completed quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. Because humans did not announce turning points, they executed them, and somewhere in the dark, between stars, human fleets waited not for orders to attack, but for the moment the Concord would commit fully, expose itself completely, and make the same fatal mistake humanity had survived learning to exploit. By the time the Concord realized that human silence was not surrender, the shape of the conflict had already changed in ways their models could not describe, because the humans were no longer reacting to Concord movements but guiding them. And the first sign of this came when supply convoys began failing to arrive at forward fleet anchors without any recorded engagement, no distress calls, no debris fields large enough to indicate battle, just absence, which unsettled Virellian commanders, trained to expect visible cause and effect. And when questions were raised, the archivist reassured them that human logistics had always been fragile and chaotic, arguing that what they were seeing was likely human infrastructure collapse under pressure, a conclusion that fit the historical pattern they believed they understood. Yet aboard the human carrier Resolute Edge, Captain Daniel Mercer watched real-time projections of Concord fleet vectors with a calm that came from decades of planning for exactly this kind of misunderstanding, and he reminded his crew that the enemy was not foolish, only predictable, and predictability was more dangerous than ignorance, because it encouraged confidence, and confidence created overextension, which was why human ships were striking nowhere and everywhere at once, slipping into Concord supply lanes using navigation techniques derived from old asteroid mining practices that Virellian science had dismissed as inefficient centuries earlier, and these human raiders did not fight battles. They erased links, destroying fuel tenders, corrupting navigation buoys, and injecting false data into Concord command networks, all actions too small to trigger strategic alarms individually, but devastating in accumulation. And back on the Concord flagship, High Strategist Threxel reviewed reports showing minor but widespread logistical degradation, and he dismissed concerns raised by a junior tactician who suggested the humans were intentionally avoiding decisive engagement, because in Virellian doctrine avoidance indicated weakness, not intent, and Threxel ordered continued advance, accelerating the timetable to force a final confrontation, a decision applauded by the Council as evidence of firm leadership. While on Earth, Ambassador Holt received the official notice of escalation and quietly forwarded it to Admiral Hale with a single line that read, "They have chosen the window," and Hale responded with equal brevity, "Then we close it." And across human space fleets that had been dispersed for weeks began subtle convergence, not massing in obvious formations, but aligning trajectories that would intersect only if one knew where to look, and human civilian broadcasts continued to show debate, protest, and political tension. Because humanity understood the value of appearing divided, a lesson learned the hard way across centuries of conflict, and this illusion of disorder further reinforced Concord assumptions, leading them to commit their reserve fleets earlier than planned to secure symbolic targets rather than strategic ones, including the densely populated system of Helios Gate, whose capture was meant to demonstrate Concord authority to both humans and neutral observers. Yet Helios Gate had been quietly emptied weeks earlier, its population relocated under the cover of routine trade traffic, leaving behind only automated infrastructure and a network of dormant defense platforms that the Concord scans identified, but dismissed as obsolete. And when the Concord fleet arrived in force, broadcasting victory declarations across open channels, Admiral Hale gave the final authorization that released a cascade of human responses synchronized across dozens of systems. Because Helios Gate was not a prize but a trigger, and as Concord ships moved to establish orbit, the first defense platform activated not by firing weapons, but by altering local space geometry using gravity manipulation techniques humans had perfected for deep space construction, creating subtle distortions that interfere with Concord shield harmonics, a phenomenon their scientists had theorized but never weaponized because it required accepting unacceptable levels of risk, something humans had long since normalized. And as Concord sensors struggled to recalibrate, human fleets emerged from vectors previously believed impassable, not as a single overwhelming force, but as layered waves, each exploiting a different weakness, forcing Concord commanders to fight on multiple cognitive levels at once. And for the first time since the operation began, Concord ships fired in panic rather than precision, and the galaxy began to witness the moment when studying human history proved insufficient, because the Concord had learned what humans failed to do, but not what they learned to survive. The shock of Helios Gate did not come from losses alone, but from the way those losses unfolded, because Concord commanders could not identify a single decisive action to counter, only a spreading sense that every response made the situation worse, and this confusion deepened as human tactics refused to resolve into familiar patterns, with human ships disengaging the moment Concord forces attempted concentration, then reappearing hours later at different ranges and angles, forcing continuous recalculation that exhausted alien crews unaccustomed to prolonged uncertainty. And on the Concord flagship, Drexel demanded explanations as reports showed shield failures cascading unpredictably, weapons locking onto false targets, and entire squadrons drifting out of formation due to navigation errors traced back to corrupted stellar reference points. Something the Archivist insisted should be impossible, because the Concord used redundant systems designed to prevent exactly that. Yet those systems shared assumptions humans did not, and Admiral Hale had built his strategy around exploiting assumptions rather than systems, a lesson learned from ancient naval warfare, where the strongest fleets fell not to superior firepower, but to misread intent. And as human fleets continued to apply pressure, without offering a clear front line, Concord morale began to fracture in subtle ways, not through fear, but through doubt, because Virellian culture valued predictability and order, and without those anchors their commanders hesitated, delaying decisions by seconds that cost ships and lives, while human crews operated under mission command doctrines that encouraged initiative and adaptation, allowing them to exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for permission. And this contrast became stark during the engagement at Ravelin Drift, where a Concord battle group attempted to regroup around a damaged carrier, only to find its protective screen peeled away by human electronic warfare pulses tuned to individual ship signatures, something Concord intelligence had believed impossible due to encryption complexity, unaware that humans had spent centuries breaking their own codes during internal conflicts, and Captain Mercer personally authorized a close approach maneuver that would have been considered reckless by Concord standards, threading his carrier through debris and radiation clouds to deploy strike craft at point-blank range, not to destroy the carrier outright, but to disable its command core, leaving it intact yet blind, a message as much as a tactic. And as news of the spread through Concord channels, junior officers began quietly questioning doctrine, asking why human ships seemed willing to accept damage that Concord vessels avoided at all costs. And the answer lay in human history the Concord had studied but misunderstood, because humans did not glorify survival, they glorified continuation, and this difference mattered when losses mounted. And back on Earth, President Bennett addressed the assembly not with reassurance, but with blunt assessment, stating that the conflict would be long, costly, and unavoidable, and that the goal was not victory as the Concord understood it, but a turn so overwhelming it would rewrite galactic assumptions. Words that would have sounded extreme to alien ears, but resonated deeply with human leaders shaped by wars that ended only when the cost of fighting became unbearable, and as the Concord Council debated whether to seek mediation or escalate further, unaware that hesitation itself was now a vulnerability, Admiral Hale watched the latest projections and knew the window was closing, because the Concord was beginning to adapt, slowly but visibly, and humans could not allow them time to recover equilibrium, and so he authorized Phase Cinder, a coordinated action that shifted the conflict from disruption to demonstration, not aimed at annihilation but at clarity, because humans had learned that enemies who understood too late would still fight, but enemies who understood too well would stop. And the galaxy was about to be shown not how humans won wars, but how they ended them. Phase Cinder unfolded without announcement or flourish, because human planners understood that spectacle was only effective when it followed comprehension, and the first indication that something had changed came when Concord early warning arrays across 6 sectors began reporting identical anomalies at the same moment, a statistical impossibility that immediately triggered internal alarms. Yet before countermeasures could be coordinated, those arrays went dark one by one, not destroyed but repurposed, their data streams hijacked and fed back into Concord Command as flawless confirmations of normal space, creating a blindfold rather than blackout. And this distinction mattered because Concord doctrine treated absence of data as danger but trusted presence implicitly, and so fleets continued to maneuver based on information that had been carefully edited by human systems designed to mimic Concord's sensor logic better than the Concord themselves understood it, a capability born From decades of humans designing systems to deceive other humans who shared similar cognitive shortcuts, and as fleets advanced into positions that appeared optimal, human forces executed synchronized strikes against infrastructure rather than ships, targeting relay stations, fabrication nodes, and energy collectors that sustained Concord military reach far from their core worlds. Actions that did not immediately kill, but began a countdown to Concord, could not stop because their fleets were built to fight battles, not survive isolation, and high strategist Drexel found himself issuing orders that grew increasingly cautious, slowing advances and recalling outlying units, only to discover that retreat paths were now compromised by subtle gravitational disruptions seeded days earlier, turning familiar corridors into traps that punished movement in any direction. And as casualties mounted, the Concord Council demanded decisive action, pressing Drexel to authorize the use of overwhelming force against a human population center to break morale, a suggestion that revealed how deeply they misunderstood what sustained human resolve. And though Drexel hesitated, he ultimately approved a limited strike on the industrial world of Kestrel Reach, calculating that the loss of production hub would force Earth to negotiate, unaware that Kestrel Reach had been deliberately left operating as bait, its factories hardened, its population evacuated, and its defenses tuned not to repel but to record. And when the Concord bombardment began, human sensors captured every energy signature, firing pattern, and command sequence, data that was transmitted galaxy-wide within minutes, not as propaganda but as evidence, showing neutral powers exactly how the Concord enforced compliance. And this exposure triggered immediate political shockwaves, as several species withdrew support or declared neutrality, fracturing the coalition the Concord relied upon, while at the same time, human fleets executed the second half of Phase Cinder by striking Concord shipyards near their borders, facilities previously considered untouchable because they lay outside the immediate theater, and these strikes were precise to the point of restraint, disabling production without causing civilian loss, a calculated contrast to Kestrel Reach that further isolated the Concord diplomatically, and aboard the Concord flagship Drexel finally acknowledged what the archivists could not, that studying human history had taught them what humans regretted, but not what humans institutionalized, and that every failure humans recorded became doctrine, every loss became redundancy, and every near collapse became a margin of safety. And as he watched reports confirming that Concord fleet readiness had dropped below sustainable thresholds, Drexel requested authorization to open negotiations, only to be told that the Council no longer believed negotiation was possible from a position of weakness, a decision that sealed the Concord's fate, because humans recognize that moment instantly as the point where an enemy stops thinking strategically and starts thinking emotionally, and Admiral Hale issued the final orders of Phase Cinder, knowing that the next actions would not merely win the war, but redefine the meaning of provoking humanity in a galaxy that had finally begun to pay attention. Phase Cinder's culmination did not announce itself with fireworks or dramatic proclamations, because humans understood that decisive moments were quiet until they became undeniable, and the first indication that the Concord had miscalculated catastrophically came when entire Concord battle groups failed to respond to enemy maneuvers that previously would have forced instant counterattacks, not because of fear, but because human strategy had anticipated and neutralized their decision-making loops, exploiting predictable command hierarchies, chain of command delays, and psychological assumptions embedded over millennia. And as human fleets converged across multiple vectors, they did so in patterns designed to appear disorganized, which reinforced Concord belief in their own tactical superiority, even as it drew the alien forces into increasingly untenable positions. And across human-controlled systems, civilians watched the news feeds, not in panic, but in quiet expectation, because every evacuation, every procedural drill, every movement of infrastructure had been rehearsed for years to support precisely this moment. And it was not chaos, but choreography, while Admiral Hale personally monitored the final deployments, ensuring that each fleet, squadron, and independent strike craft was synchronized, not through constant command input, but via pre-established mission doctrine and adaptive AI coordination, allowing humans to operate faster, more decisively, and more flexibly than any alien fleet could comprehend. And on the Concord flagship, Drexel struggled to comprehend what he was seeing as reports indicated the systematic neutralization of forward supply chains, sensor arrays, and communication relays, leaving their forces isolated, blind, and vulnerable, and when they attempted to launch countermeasures, they found human electronic warfare protocols had anticipated every redundancy, every algorithmic response, every predictable attempt at interference, a level of foresight that drew directly from historical human experiences where enemies had exploited patterns of overconfidence to devastating effect. And as the first human strike teams penetrated previously defended orbital installations, they did not simply destroy weapons, but rewrote systems to support human fleet movements, creating corridors of operational freedom, while simultaneously leaving decoy signatures to mislead remaining Concord units, and in the council chambers back home on Earth. President Bennett briefed the Security Assembly with a calm clarity born from decades of human military doctrine distilled into simple operational principles. Do not seek glory, do not underestimate preparation, and never assume the enemy knows your limits. And as word of human precision and coordination spread across Concord channels, the initial shock became panic, then paralysis, because alien commanders could no longer predict outcomes based on historical human behavior, and every attempt at direct engagement resulted in cascading failures as Concord vessels collided, misfired, or left stranded without fuel, while humans, learning from centuries of internal conflict, treated every loss as a data point, every setback as a rehearsal for the next maneuver, and every engagement as an opportunity to exploit misunderstanding. And as the Concord debated desperate proposals for ceasefire or withdrawal, human fleets converged on the central system of the Virellian Core not as a frontal assault, but through infiltration, subterfuge, and leverage of previously ignored hyperlanes, bypassing heavily defended choke points. And when the first human fleet emerged from these vectors, Drexel finally realized the fatal truth that human resilience, ingenuity, and discipline were not exceptions to their studied history, but the very constants, and that every prior mistake Concord analysts had cataloged as weakness was in fact an indicator of adaptability. And with the Core now under immediate threat, the Concord Council could only watch as humans, methodical, patient, and relentless, demonstrated that knowing human history did not equate to understanding human capacity, and the galaxy waited in tense silence of final, undeniable revelation of just how catastrophic their fatal miscalculation had become. By the time human forces reached the outskirts of the Virellian Core, the Concord fleets were no longer coordinated armies, but fragmented remnants struggling to maintain coherence under constant, unpredictable pressure, and every attempt at engagement resulted in misaligned maneuvers, friendly fire incidents, and cascading system failures that compounded previous losses. While Admiral Hale's strategy unfolded like a silent symphony, each move calculated not to annihilate the Concord outright, but to expose their vulnerabilities fully, demonstrating that the humans had not only survived centuries of internal chaos, but had perfected the art of turning apparent disorder into overwhelming advantage. And aboard every human vessel crews worked with quiet precision, executing maneuvers that exploited gravitational anomalies, shield harmonics, and energy flux patterns that Concord engineers had never considered as operationally significant, while on Earth President Bennett monitored data. Streams that showed the full scope of phase eclipse, the operation designed to bring the Concord to the point of total strategic dislocation without firing a single indiscriminate weapon. And as human electronic warfare teams infiltrated Central Command nodes, Concord communications faltered, fleets received conflicting orders, and the Council itself became a target, with its own command protocols feeding false readings back into decision chain, creating delays measured in minutes that for humans were opportunities measured in light seconds, and the alien commanders struggled to respond, issuing increasingly desperate and fragmented orders, while the humans moved like shadows through the theater, striking only where it mattered, neutralizing critical systems, isolating capital ships, and cutting off reinforcements, all the while avoiding unnecessary destruction, because humanity's goal was control, not mindless slaughter, and the contrast with Concord assumptions was stark. Their study of human history having taught them only the pattern of human failure, not the discipline born from surviving it. And as the first human task forces established positions around the core worlds, exploiting hyperlane junctions and uncharted subspace corridors, entire Concord squadrons were forced into untenable positions where retreat was impossible without abandoning critical assets. And when the Council attempted to rally its forces, the very infrastructure command had been turned against them with human AI systems feeding synthetic data that synchronized enemy movement with predetermined counters, causing alien formations to collapse under the weight of their own protocols, and on the surface of key core worlds, evacuated populations observed silently as human strike teams secured orbital stations and planetary defenses without triggering mass panic, because every civilian relocation and contingency had been prepared in advance, turning fear into operational freedom. And as the Concord finally recognized the magnitude of their miscalculation, realizing that knowing human history had provided no insight into human ingenuity, adaptability, or ruthlessness in defense of their survival, Admiral Hale authorized the final phase, not a battle of attrition, but a demonstration of absolute operational mastery, striking simultaneously across multiple vectors, disabling warship after warship, severing supply chains and forcing surrender not through annihilation but through the clear, undeniable proof that humans had learned from every past failure, mastered every apparent weakness, and in the process transformed every assumption of the galaxy against them into a catastrophic vulnerability. And as the Concord High Council capitulated, overwhelmed by precision, timing, and inexorable logic of human strategy, the galaxy understood for the first time that underestimating humanity was a mistake that could never be undone, and that the species which had once been dismissed as primitive, chaotic, and fragile now stood as a standard of discipline, innovation, and survival that no civilization could afford to ignore. As the Concord surrendered and human forces assumed control of key strategic points across the core, the galaxy began to perceive the full scope of humanity's capabilities, not merely in military terms, but in organizational genius, adaptive thinking, and the ability to exploit assumptions, because every action taken by human fleets had been designed to teach a lesson as much as achieve a result. And across former Concord territory, scientists, engineers, and logisticians began reviewing the captured infrastructure with meticulous care, learning the secrets of alien technology, while simultaneously demonstrating human creativity in repurposing those systems for efficiency, expansion, and defense. And aboard the Resolute Edge, Captain Mercer oversaw the integration of captured hyperlanes and navigation networks into human command channels, ensuring that the next generation of fleets would move faster, strike harder, and anticipate potential threats before they became crises. While Admiral Hale coordinated with President Bennett and Ambassador Holt to establish protocols for maintaining order across newly liberated systems, recognizing that a true demonstration of human superiority required not only battlefield success, but governance, diplomacy, and stability, and as humans established contact with neutral and previously hostile species across the galaxy, they presented evidence of the Concord's failures, not to humiliate, but to redefine interstellar norms, showing that foresight, preparation, and adaptability were more potent than raw firepower, and that underestimating a civilization based solely on historical precedent was a fatal error. And while former Concord commanders attempted to reconcile their loss with centuries of doctrine, human analysts had already cataloged their responses, understanding how fear, surprise, and strategic overload had cascaded into collapse, turning alien arrogance into lessons for future generations. And as settlements across former Concord worlds began to receive human administrators, engineers, and peacekeeping forces, the galaxy observed not conquest, but methodical stabilization, because humans recognized that victory was not measured solely by enemy destruction, but by the ability to maintain and expand influence without creating chaos. And as Ambassador Holt engaged remaining council members from allied species, presenting frameworks for joint security, trade, and conflict resolution that reflected human principles of adaptive cooperation, she emphasized that the same traits which had allowed humanity to survive internal wars and external threats, resilience, ingenuity, and strategic patience, were now being offered as models for galactic civilization. And on Earth, President Bennett addressed the Security Assembly with quiet satisfaction, stating that the Concord's collapse had been inevitable not through luck, but through the application of lessons learned over millennia, turning every prior failure, every near defeat, every moment of internal chaos into tools for overwhelming competence. And across human space, fleets returned from campaigns to refit, resupply, and train, not for revenge but for readiness, because humanity understood that the galaxy would always test them again, and that the true measure of superiority lay in the ability to anticipate, adapt, and dominate without reliance on intimidation alone. And in the council chambers of surviving Concord leaders, There was a profound recognition that studying human history had taught them only what humans had failed to do, not the systems, discipline, and determination humans had built upon those failures. And with every system stabilized, every fleet redeployed, and every ally reassured, the galaxy came to a single, undeniable conclusion. Humanity's rise had been deliberate, inevitable, and irreversible, and any species foolish enough to provoke or underestimate them again would do so at their own peril. With the galaxy now fully aware of humanity's capabilities, the final phase of the campaign focused not on destruction, but on establishing a durable framework that ensured human influence would be respected across star systems. Because every engagement, every maneuver, every calculated risk taken during the conflict had been designed to convey a lesson as much as achieve victory. And as fleets redeployed to secure former Concord territories, human engineers, diplomats, and military officers worked in seamless coordination, demonstrating that adaptability, foresight, and precision were as much weapons as any warship or weapon system. And aboard the Resolute Edge, Admiral Hale reviewed reports showing that all remaining Concord forces were contained, communication networks were fully integrated into human command, and neutral species had accepted human-led protocols for security, trade, and governance, a testament to centuries of learned resilience transformed into operational mastery. And on Earth, President Bennett convened the Security Assembly to outline long-term strategies for interstellar diplomacy, emphasizing that true strength lay not in intimidation or coercion alone, but in the ability to project competence, foresight, and fairness, and that every failure, setback, and internal conflict humanity had endured in its own history had been converted into doctrine, training, and infrastructure that allowed the species to survive, adapt, and now lead the galaxy, while Ambassador Holt engaged representatives from formerly hostile and neutral species, demonstrating the systems, technologies, and protocols humans had established to prevent future miscalculations, emphasizing that cooperation with humanity was not subjugation, but participation in a framework proven to be resilient under extreme pressure. And across human-controlled systems, civilians returned to work alongside military personnel, rebuilding infrastructure, stabilizing economies, and ensuring continuity of daily life even as fleets remained at readiness, because humans understood that the projection of power was meaningless without stability and governance, and as former Concord leaders attempted to reconcile their own histories of overconfidence, arrogance, and misjudgment, they realized that studying human history had provided no insight into the discipline, creativity, and adaptability that humanity had institutionalized, and every assumption that had guided the Council, every model that had predicted failure, every expectation of weakness had been turned against them, resulting not merely in defeat, but in a complete redefinition of interstellar norms. And as human fleets patrolled, human engineers repaired, and human diplomats negotiated, the galaxy came to an unambiguous understanding. Humanity could not be underestimated. Every historical lesson was a tool they would wield, and the species that once appeared chaotic, fragile, and predictable had now proven itself the most disciplined, strategic, and inexorably capable civilization among the stars, a force whose reach, intellect, and foresight ensured that any future miscalculation by an alien power would be met not with mercy, but with a full measure of human capability. And the Virellian Concord, once the dominant power of its sector, now served as a cautionary example to all, a testament that understanding human history, without understanding human resilience and strategic brilliance, was the gravest mistake any species could make. And with every star system stabilized, every fleet operational, and every diplomatic channel secure, humanity stood unchallenged as a standard of power, innovation, and adaptability, a species whose rise had been deliberate, calculated, and utterly irreversible, and whose future dominance was assured by the very lessons the galaxy had failed to learn until it was far too late.